Um, Welcome back. We're on time, almost, and we'll try and stick to it. So I'm going to, first of all, thank you to Sharon and to Carl Skelton and for organizing this and all the other events that are going on around here relating to Xenakis. It's great to see. I'm going to talk about a specific project, and I've got a lot of, I'll try and get through this quickly because there's a lot of things that I wanted to bring up. This Kraanerg is an interesting project, not only for Xenakis. It was a big piece of work of his, but also for the situation of the commission and all of that. It's actually connected to a very important cultural event in the history of Canada, actually, and somehow he was right in the middle of it. So I wanted to take a look at the various things around the piece and then spend not very much time, but a little bit of time just talking about the music too. There's a lot more work to do on this, and I'm hoping to get to the archives to actually dig through some of it. Anyway, just an introduction. This piece, Kraanerg, which is one of Xenakis' biggest pieces in terms of its substance and length and so on, came from the National Ballet of Canada. It was commissioned for the inauguration of the National Arts Centre in Ottawa, and it was actually a commission that was given to Rowan Petit, the choreographer. So the Xenakis came into the picture, but it wasn't a commission to him first. It was a commission to the choreographer who then recommended him. Big piece, 75 minutes, large ensemble plus 4-channel tape, and this is one of those examples of combining electronics and instruments. From what I can tell from looking through the archives, and there are good archives in the National Ballet of Canada and the National Arts Centre, this production of this piece, of that event, the gala event, which mainly included this piece, cost about $200,000 in 1969, which I figure is somewhere over $1 million, which is a big deal, even today. So, who are these people? The National Ballet of Canada is not the only. It's a ballet company based in Toronto. There were others already established. The Ballet Canadien in Montreal is one that's sort of on the same stature, and then the Royal Ballet in Winnipeg, already established. The reason that the National Ballet was brought into this project was because of, I'm surmising, a friendship between Celia Franca, who was the artistic director, and the programming director of the National Arts Centre, who chose to involve them rather than the other companies that they might have asked. So then the National Arts Centre, this is sort of like the Kennedy Center in Washington. This is a large thing, and it was a big project that had been intended for the Canadian Centennial. It ran over budget, it ran over time, as these things often do, and it came, instead of 1967 when it was supposed to be done, it was finished in 1969. And during that period, David Haber became the director of programming. He was brought on board. And there's the other interesting connection that happens is that David Haber, actually a couple interesting connections. One is that he became the artistic director of the National Ballet after Celia Franca briefly. But before he went to the National Arts Centre, he was involved in programming for Expo 67 in Montreal. And so there's a connection there. And the Expo in Montreal of course, has a Xenakis connection, and one of the most important elements of the Expo 67 was the French Pavilion, which is still standing, one of, I think, the only one that's still a functioning structure. Now there's a casino there, but when I first moved to Montreal, it was still a museum, and the Xenakis' installation was still there. And of course, Xenakis was involved with this Polytope de Montréal, and that was his first, aside from the Phillips Pavilion, which he was partially involved in terms of all of the multimedia stuff. This was the first one where he was involved in the whole installation. He didn't build the building or design it, but he put in this installation and had these performances. And there are many people who I've met, and maybe some of you who still talk about that. It made a big impression. Just like the Phillips Pavilion is one of the few things people talk about from the World's Fair in Brussels in 1958, and this is one of the things people still talk about. And so David Haber, who became the programming director in the National Arts Center, would have heard of Xenakis. But like I said, this project was the National Ballet of Canada, who then were looking for a choreographer to create a new ballet. They weren't looking directly to Xenakis yet. So some of the connection that's come out, which is interesting, they started talking about involving the National Ballet from as early as 1966, but it was basically in 67 when David Haber came on board that they started talking about doing something for the gala. The money for the National Arts Center comes directly from the federal government, so it's a special funding thing, and they were looking for this to be a big deal, a major sort of national cultural center, etc., and wanted this to be the gala opening to be a big thing. And so that $200,000, was the money was coming from the federal government to make that happen. Now, what they first did, comes from looking through the archives, and it's an interesting story. First of all, they wanted to bring in a star. Like, this was coming from the National Arts Center in their discussions with the National Ballet. We need to have a superstar as part of this show. Rudolf Nureyev was talked about, and he was the one they wanted. And I think that was one of the reasons why the National Ballet turned to Rowan Petit as the choreographer. I apologize for some of these photos. I got them from the archive in the National Ballet in Toronto, and these are basically thumbnail. So I haven't yet got the full scans of everything, so they're not great. But anyway, that's Rowan Petit in development in 1969 as they were working on this project. Now who was he? For those of us who aren't really part of the dance world, he was quite important as a choreographer in France. It's, some people say he's the most significant, but of course that would be debatable. He had an interesting and not a straightforward sort of career. He started his own ballet companies as quite young. He then moved off to Hollywood for a while. He was involved in music hall reviews. He actually owned the Casino of Paris for a while, and then spent a long time with the Ballet de Marseille. But he did other things, including some significant commissions. So the reason that he would have been in the air in terms of this project was that he had just done, in 1967, this Paradise Lost dance piece, which was at Covent Garden in London. Rudolf Nureyev and Margot Fontaine, the two most important dancers in the world at that time. And so he got a lot of attention for that. And the music was by Marc Constant for that piece, which was interesting. He had done then, right in the middle of discussions about the Kraanerg, he had also done another dance piece with Nureyev. So Rowan Petit was the one who was going to bring Nureyev in. That was the idea, I think. Marc Constant, I didn't know this either. I knew he's known for us in the new music world as the ensemble Ars Nova. He performed music of Xenakis. He was a composer also, But he was also the music director of the Ballet de Paris. He worked a lot with Rowan Petit over many years going into this period. And so that commission for Covent Garden was probably an obvious thing for Rowan Petit to turn to Constant to do the music, because he'd been working with him for several years. For whatever reason, and I haven't found any evidence yet, but for the reason, but Constant didn't end up coming in on this project, but he was talked about. Once Rowan Petit was brought into the project, he was talking about Constant as he was going to be the composer. So that was the presumption at first. Through the various correspondences, it became clear in April of 1968 that Nureyev wasn't going to be able to do it. He wasn't going to be able to get out of whatever his engagements were to be able to do this. I found it interesting that this was coming from the Canadian side, from the National Ballet side, giving suggestions because they'd already hired Petit as the choreographer. So mentioning Jean-Paul Riopel as a designer, that would have been really interesting. One of Canada's most important visual artists. But that didn't. But it was really going to be up to Rowan Petit. Petit was talking with Celia Franca about creating this ballet around Mayakovsky, who was a famous Russian Soviet artist, writer, and so forth. That was considered, especially in the summer of 1968, was considered maybe too controversial, given the riots and things that were going on in Paris and all over the place, and they ruled that out. And this was before Xenakis came on board. Xenakis shows up in July in correspondence, and so at some point Constant must have indicated that he couldn't do this commission. So they talked about it, then they contacted him in August of 1968. He signed a contract, and actually it was on his initiative, Xenakis' initiative, that Victor Vassarelli, who's a well-known op art kind of visual artist who was based in France, he was brought on as the designer. Hang on. Now, from what I can tell, the National Ballet of Canada were open to this. This was coming from Petit, and they had basically put their confidence in him. But it's also, they would have heard of Xenakis as a composer, possibly from the expo in Montreal, and possibly because he had some pieces done as dance pieces. And I don't know if you can see this very well, but probably most significant would have been the George Balanchine dances that he'd set Metastasis and Pithopracta to dance in. It had been presented in New York in 1968 and was quite successful and so they would have maybe heard of him. In any case, he was brought in on board, and it's interesting to look at the contract stuff. I mean, there's no secrets here or anything. So in September, Xenakis was agreeing to finish the score. Remember, 75 minutes, 23 instruments, 4-channel tape, and have it all the score, the parts, and a recording of the live part and the electroacoustic part, all done in time for the rehearsals to start in April the 1st. He was given, basically the contract said that he was required to collaborate with the choreographer and the scenic designer. The duration, he was given the choice of conductor. They were originally talking about Seiji Ozawa. Lucas Foss was put forward by Xenakis, and he'd just been working with him right around that time on some other performances. $12,000 is what he got paid, plus expenses, including production, which was significant because of the needing to produce this tape and also record the ensemble part so that they could rehearse to it. No way to do a piano reduction in this case. $12,000. Actually, when they were first talking about expenses, they were proposing something like $4,000. So he did well on this in terms of negotiating, and then there's a completely separate agreement with the Boosey and Hawkes, who the publisher or Xenakis' publisher at that time, and actually that was a significant expense as well, and part of it they had to guarantee a minimum number of performances, and it was 50. And they paid a certain amount, like $100 per performance in additional fees. Now, what was he doing at that time? This is another thing, just to put this into context. I know that Sean says that professors don't really do work much, but he was a full-time professor at that period, starting from '67 in Indiana. And that meant, because of everything else he was doing quite a bit of traveling, going back and forth to Paris and so forth, including in October, where he had some featured pieces as part of the festival. He was involved in setting up his institute in Paris, which got going that same year. And in particular, Nomos Gamma is a huge piece for orchestra, as many people would know. And it's one of those pieces, as was mentioned earlier, where every part has it's a spatialized piece like Teratector. It's actually more than 88 players. I think it's 96. Everybody has their own part. It's 20-something minutes. It's a substantial piece that was premiered at the festival in France in April of that year. So clearly. And he hadn't finished it in September of 1968 when he signed that contract. He was probably in the middle of it. And he was also had other pieces on the go. Anactoria and Persifasa. Persifasa is another significant piece. So it's not like he was sitting around with nothing else to do, is the point. And one of the things that is interesting and that Benoit Gibson has done a lot of work on is, the relationship between these pieces that he was working on at the same time. Nomos Gamma in particular having lots of shared material with Kraanerg in various ways. You probably can't see that either. This comes from the original program, but essentially Rowan Petit took the Xenakis wrote the music. They did talk, but he wasn't given really any direction, which shows a lot of courage, I would say, on the part of the choreographer. They just go and write 75 minutes worth of music, and I don't mind what it is. And so when he and we'll get into the relationship between the choreography and the music a little bit, but. What Petit did was basically create a ballet out of this music. The music is continuous; it's not in movements at all. But he basically, once he got there ready to work with the company and had the materials, he derived this kind of structure from the music. There was a bit of a program as they say, there's no kind of a story to this piece, which is unusual for a ballet piece. They usually do have a narrative of some kind. Maybe one of the ones that I think of as maybe similar to Kraanerg would be, what's it called by Stravinsky? I can't think of it. The one I'm talking about, 1956. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's more abstract as a piece, but most choreographies, most commissions for choreography are telling a story like Paradise Lost or whatever. So this is coming out of press, in advance of the premiere. So Xenakis had his take on it. Lucas Foss had an interesting take on it when he was coming in for rehearsals, and Petit also. And then they made a program, a little bit of a statement about a program, the meaning of the word Kraanerg, and a little bit of reference. And Xenakis had written some other things, basically tying this music to all of the upheaval going on in the world around in 1968, 69, and also this statement about the population growth and the kinds of upheaval that was going to lead to in a larger scale. Now I got a little slideshow, so I'll play this. Out of focus, but these are all photos from the ballet in Ottawa. So it's about a minute, so I'll just play this. I put in some music. They don't correspond, it's just so you can hear a bit of the music, hopefully. You see these sets of Vasarely also. Okay, so now I don't have time to get into this. I'm just going to skip through it. There are some sketches that I have seen. I'd like to see the rest, but where Xenakis was thinking in quite abstract terms in terms of putting this music together, and he so basic elements, and then he developed a form, and I made this chart which shows essentially the play between the live ensemble and the tape part, and they were treated very separately. So the piece basically goes in a kind of block-like form, goes continuously from beginning to end. Petit put his 11 movements in there. They actually had an intermission in the middle of it, which is interesting, and Xenakis actually saw that would be a possibility because of the need to change the tape. He couldn't get 75 minutes of tape onto one reel, so they would have had it on two. A reel, I think, would hold about 40 minutes, and so they would have had to either have two operators. And but in any case, he actually, it sounds like, from what I can tell, that he was willing for that to happen. And it did happen. Even now, when we listen to recordings, there's no intermission there. Because he had not very much time to write this music, it really is a kind of a cut and paste job. He treated the winds and the strings as completely separate, and when you see the score, you can see that he really did literally write out music for the winds, cut parts of it, stick it in there, and have completely separate material for the strings. And so his formal structure was built on that idea, this kind of block-like or mosaic kind of approach. And there's a lot more that I'd like to look into in terms of how it all got put together. Reception. There's the Prime Minister, came to this show, newly elected Pierre Elliott Trudeau, talking to Veronica Tennant. And so what happened after that, just quickly to finish up, the National Ballet of Canada performed it twice there, and then performed it a total of 19 times over 4 seasons. So they performed it in Toronto, which is their home base. They took it on tour in the West Coast, United States and Canada, and they took it to Europe, and that was the end of it for them. I'm not sure if they just paid up the Boozing Hawks for their 50 performances that they were supposed to do, but one of the problems they had was that the reason that the ensemble was 23 people was that that was their touring orchestra. They had a set ensemble that would play whatever else they were doing when they were on tour, and that was it. Only Xenakis changed it. He didn't want to use the instruments that they needed to have on tour. He added things like contrabass, bassoon, and some other instruments that would have made it harder for them to take it on tour with the ensemble. They would have had to add people and just for that piece. So it was harder for them to do in that sense. The other thing is that there weren't great reviews for the choreography. It was fairly mixed in terms of people not thinking that the choreography really matched the music at all, and other people who maybe responded to the choreography but didn't like the music. There's I've gone through a lot of that, and really, even in the dance world, people I think were more impressed or responded more to the music than to the choreography. And generally, although you can find exceptions in the reports, that they felt like the choreography didn't really match the music. No other companies took it up at all. And so, it's kind of sad. It's a huge piece, a lot of work, and didn't have a life as a dance piece beyond that, except for one other, Roger Woodward, who's one of the Xenakis performers, part of this new book that Sharon has mentioned. He worked with a choreographer in Sydney in Australia, and they actually put on 23 performances in 1 month. This is quite impressive. And in 1988, and issued a CD of it, and that was, that actually brought the piece to attention again. It was pretty much forgotten otherwise. I think I'll just get there's a little bit of a clip from that. Anyway, just to mention that I haven't. This isn't a definitive list of performances, but ones that I've been aware of, and I don't think there might be a couple others, but really not more than that. So it was performed once in 1977 as part of this big festival of Xenakis pieces. It was performed in Australia in 1988, of course, and then a couple other times since. No other dance versions, although I would say that Vancouver New Music, who performed the piece this last year, intend to do it again and would like to get a new choreography to do with it. But for a really important piece, this is not a huge life, not a hugely successful life of a piece. However, I would say that the recordings that have come out, and in particular the Mode DVD CD that came out a couple of years ago, are helping, because that in particular, although you can debate whether you like the video representation they created to go with it, but it's a really great recording, and the nice thing about the DVD is that you can hear it in a sort of surround version as it was intended. I'd never heard it live until last year in Vancouver, when you can hear the 4 channels, and it's a totally different piece when you can hear the whole thing the way it's supposed to sound. So let's hope that it does continue, and hopefully in Vancouver they can get that together and take it out on tour and give us a new version of it. So there we go. Thank you.